Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in. So this is your first sample question on the very important topic of dependent children as it relates to your upcoming full skills exam. This question is going to deal with LICO and dependent children. So as we saw in the previous lesson, there are a couple exceptions to LICO, there are a couple of requirements. This question here is going to help you transfer that knowledge of LICO as it relates to dependent children into an exam setting. Now remember that LICO plays a really important role in the exam, and it plays a role in every program really within the family class. So it's a really important topic to completely understand, and by completing this question you're going to be one step closer to really being able to master that topic. All right, so here is your question. You can see a little countdown timer on the bottom, and I'm hoping that you can try to work through this question in 2 minutes. So I'll read it to you just in case you are busy here. All right, so we have Danielle. Danielle is a Canadian citizen who has been living in Toronto for the last 5 years. She recently met Matthew, a New Zealander, while on a business trip in Shanghai, and they've fallen in love. The couple has made plans to get married in Danielle's hometown of Grayson, Saskatchewan in a year, and they will then begin the immigration process to have Matthew and his 17-year-old son Franklin become permanent residents so that they can move to Toronto permanently. Franklin has a 1-year-old dependent child named Marcos and would also like to bring him to live in Canada. In order to begin the process, Danielle asks Eric, an RCIC, to ask if there is anything that she can start preparing now to make the process as straightforward as possible. Other than proving that the marriage is legal and living/financial arrangements have been made, what is RCIC Eric likely to advise? And then we have A, B, C, D. So A says that Danielle will need to prove joint rental agreements and bills for the year before Matthew, Franklin, and Marcos move to Canada. And we have B, that she'll need to prove around $50,000 of income for the 12 months before sponsoring Matthew and Franklin. We have C, that she will need to prove around $25,000 of income for the 12 months before sponsoring Matthew and Franklin. And finally, D, that she will have to simply prove that the marriage is legal. So you saw that the countdown timer ended, and obviously I'm reading deliberately and slowly. So for all of you, I mean, that was 2 minutes. So remember, when you're in the real exam, and if you're working with our practice materials, it's a really good idea, of course, to get into the habit of reading quickly. That's something that we talk about in the seminar quite a bit. So if you're joining us for the Full Skills Exam Prep Seminar, perfect. We're going to have some tools to make sure that we can move through all of these questions really quickly. So I hope that you got the answer during this time. If you are listening to me and you need some extra time, well, you can press pause right now. All right, if you pressed pause and you worked through the question, we're going to continue on. We'll explore each option and, of course, work through which ones aren't the answers and which one is the correct answer. So let's take a look at A here. Now, essentially, what this question is testing you on is your knowledge of both marriage and the requirements to sponsor a spouse, and also the requirements to sponsor that spouse's dependent child and the dependent child of that dependent child. All right, so A shows you that you really have to understand spousal sponsorship and common law sponsorship in order to know that A is incorrect. So we could see that with A, the couple is going to get married in Grayson, Saskatchewan in a year, and then they'll begin the immigration process.
Now, you might remember this from the previous lesson on spousal sponsorship, that the proof used in spousal sponsorship is pretty straightforward. If the couple got married in Canada, essentially they need that wedding certificate. What they're trying to do with this one here is trick you into thinking that spousal sponsorship has the same proof requirements as a common law sponsorship. If the couple were in a common law relationship, then yes, they would have to prove joint rental agreements, they're living together for a year, etc. But in this case, the couple's going to get married. So they would have to prove the marriage certificate, which means that A is incorrect. Now, with this, we know that A is incorrect. So let's take a look at D next. You'll see that B and C are essentially very similar answers with a different amount of money, really. So let's take a look at D, since it is different from the other two, and hopefully that will bring us another step closer to answering the question. All right, so when we take a look at D, D says that she, as in Danielle, will have to simply prove that the marriage is legal. Now let's dig a little bit further into here. When we go back to that scenario, we know that the couple is going to get married next year in Canada. So that gives us one little piece of the puzzle. But we need to understand that Matthew is bringing a dependent child. And that dependent child also has a dependent child. So essentially what we're trying to solve over here is what type of proof is needed for a spousal sponsorship where the person being sponsored has a dependent child who has a dependent child. So let's add on to what we were just talking about when we analyzed A. The couple will definitely need to prove that their Canadian wedding is legal, which is pretty easily done through a marriage certificate. That, of course, is because the wedding was in Canada. Now, when we start looking at LICO, we have to understand that sponsoring a spouse means that Danielle would not have to meet the LICO. Same thing with sponsoring a spouse. So if she were to sponsor Matthew and Matthew only had a 17-year-old dependent child, Franklin, again, Danielle would not have to meet the LICO. But the difference here is that she is sponsoring Matthew and Matthew has a dependent child, and that dependent child has a dependent child. So in this case here, there's no exemption from the LICO requirement.
So now we're left with two answers. We're left with B and C, and essentially they're just questions about LICO and money. So one is $50,000, or actually it says around $50,000, and the other one says around $25,000. So let's see which one it is. If it is B, then obviously it's not C, and if it's the opposite, then of course we know the correct answer. All right, so in order to get this answer correct, well, we need to look, of course, at the number of people who we're going to need to include in LICO. All right, so we have they plan to get married with the 17-year-old son, and we have the dependent child of the dependent child. So how many people do you think that is then? So we're adding Danielle plus 3 people. All right, so when we take a look at the LICO, so for 2018, it will be around $46,000 that Danielle would need to prove. All right, so the exact number, of course, is in your test day data booklet. And even if you're watching this in 2019, 2020, well, your test day data booklet, of course, is perfectly updated with the exact Generally speaking, the number increases by about $500 per year. All right, so when we take a look at this number here, the 2018 LICO, and we take a look at, well, it's the average number for it. So is $46,000 closer to $50,000 or $25,000? Well, obviously, we know that it is closer to $50,000. So this leads us towards B. Now B is the correct answer. You might say it's not perfect. No, it's not perfect, of course. That's something we talk about in the seminar, as well as how to differentiate those answers that can be a little bit vague or a little bit tricky. But of course, this is a great question to really emphasize your understanding of LICO as it pertains to an exam question. All right, well, big thank you for tuning in. If you are joining us for the seminar, I look forward to seeing you there. If you're going to work through the simulations, well, you have a lot more questions with dependent children to work through. You can start with the next two videos because those are two more questions that you're going to have to work through, and they get more and more difficult. So good luck in those ones. If you got the answer correct to this question, that is fantastic news. And I hope you get the next two correct as well. And then, of course, I hope you get all the other simulation questions correct. And finally, all the questions on the real ICCRC Full Skills Exam correct. All right, everybody, have a good day, and thank you for tuning in.